and Camille are from Ecofutures or Alluvium. I'm not quite sure which one to refer to there. Maybe you can clarify when we shoot to you in a minute. But I'll introduce you both. Starting with Camille, who has 11 years experience working for state government and private consulting firms and has technical knowledge across a wide range of industries and environmental issues. She has undertaken engagement activities with a wide range of stakeholders, including traditional owners, local councils and state government departments, industry bodies and representatives, police and emergency services, site operators and members of the public, so pretty much everyone. She's experienced in the review and dissemination of technical information for a wide range of audiences and also planning and delivery of workshops and stakeholder interviews. Camille's ability to negotiate with clients and deliver compliance outcomes was recognised in October 2019 when she was awarded the annual DES Compliance Professional Award. Congratulations, Camille, on such an outstanding achievement in compliance. Her passion for excellence and innovation in the workplace was recognised through being presented also the annual DES Motivator Award in 2016 and again being nominated in 2019. And Paul is a natural resource management specialist with 20 years experience working across state government, universities and not-for-profits. He has experience in habitat management and assessment, water quality and river health management, water resource management, monitoring and evaluation, science translation and communication, and stakeholder and community engagement. He has developed and implemented environmental, social and economic monitoring and research programs across Australia. He's most recently been responsible for the complete evaluation and redesign of the multi-million-dollar ecosystem health monitoring program and SEQ catchment report card, which is one of Australia's most comprehensive catchment monitoring and report card programs. The outcome was one of the first examples in Australia of a truly integrated environmental, social and economic monitoring program focused on improving the health of waterways. So no strangers to natural resource management. Now you collectively worked on two bodies of research. One was focused on components and recommendations specifically around NRIP, the Natural Resource Investment Program, and the other looked at the assets and threats across Queensland. So we're going to kind of start with the assets and threats and then segue into the other work. Paul or Camille, Paul, if you had to explain the purpose of this research to a family member at a social event like a barbecue, how would you do it?
I really found this question interesting, Sam, that my family knows much better than to ask me questions about what I do. So we usually stick to boating and cricket as content that's safe. But essentially to sum it up in one sentence, I suppose, it's about providing evidence for a business case to the Queensland government to be able to continue the funding to protect and restore natural resources in Queensland, if we had to put it in a nutshell. And there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath that, of course, but that's essentially what we were asked to do and the outcomes of our research.
So we've asked all of the researchers, were you surprised at any of the findings? And of course, being good researchers, it's not our job to be surprised at anything. We're very objective. But were you surprised at anything in the findings related to this body of work?
I don't think we reflected on this one as well. I don't think we were surprised so much, but we did want to acknowledge there was some clear consistency with a lot of other projects that we've been doing across the Alluvium group. And we do a lot of evaluation of natural resource management programs across the country. And what came out of this one was there was a clear consistency with a lot of the evaluation that gets done by different departments in the state and federal governments up and down the East Coast. And that's really that prep work, the time spent building the trust and relationships and enhancing skills. So making sure that staff in NRM groups have experience to be able to run those programs and retain those staff. That's always key. That's always the stuff that takes the time and takes the funding well before any actions that actually have a measurable impact in the environment take place. And that's it's very rarely funded in all of those programs, but that's always coming out as key parts. And I think it's come out a lot today that the social benefit, the social capital, that sort of social element of building the community trust in the NRM group is key and critical before you can really get on the ground and do work.
Which is the community engagement thing we were talking about previously, but also relates to things like outsourcing services to the community because it has this economic flow through kind of effect. So obviously doing this work is quite complicated. How did you actually go about doing the research that led to this, synthesized list of assets and threats and the other recommendations?
Yeah, so to distill it down into 4 main parts. The first one was to establish the magnitude of the problem at a state scale. So we're asked to do this at a state scale. So what assets were consistent across all the NRM groups, and we looked at a whole range of different NRM plans and strategies, the annual reports that have been done, a lot of program and project reports, talked to a lot of people, all of those sorts of things. And then we were asked to then overlay that with the current and future threats. So we had to identify where all of those data sets sat. I think we had a look today, Camille, we said, 100 data sets that we reviewed, both from the assets point of view and the threats point of view, and distilled them down to 79. And then we produced the maps of where all the assets were and overlaid that with where all the threats were. So we had a statewide approach to understanding where the problems were. So that was step number 1. The second one of our research was to outline the benefits of the current approach to addressing that problem. So we used an evaluation approach to do that. We had tried to identify where NRIP aligned with government objectives and priorities and how they've changed since the NRIP program actually has started. So we tried to identify that. We did that through a lot of interviews and reviewing of the reports, as I mentioned before. The third step was to outline the lessons learned in the NRIP programs, and that was aimed at improving future approaches to the NRIP program and other NRM programs from the state government's perspective. So we determined the key characteristics of successful NRIP projects, try to understand the key success criteria, so then that could be used in developing programs in the future. Which was a big part of it. And again, that we got a lot of that through interviews and then evaluating the survey results, as well as the reports that were sent through. And then finally, the last one was distilling all of that information, all of that, 200 pages of report down into a few pages for a business case for the state and now the federal governments as well.
How many people did you interview?
Kimberly, did you want to take that one, given that you did all the interviews?
It was probably, I think, over about 30 in total. I guess we had workshops with Penny Scott, Pamela Greet, Lee Blacklock, and then we have obviously the NRM representatives and some of the CEOs. So yeah, it was a fantastic opportunity, and we're really grateful for all the inputs, to be honest, because a lot of, we were going through a lot of information, and we're really grateful for the honesty that were provided in those responses, and hopefully we've articulated that through the report really well. So yeah.
Reminder to participants to pop questions in the chat at any time that you've got them. Camille, I'm not sure if this is a question for you or back to Paul, but you found that in delivering NRIP projects, that regional NRM groups were doing much more than that. They were ticking off a heap of priorities from other Queensland government programs. Can you tell me about some of those other priorities and why they're significant?
Yeah, so I guess we found a lot of overlap with NRIP and the Queensland government objectives for the community, and also the Queensland government's COVID economic recovery plan as well. So it wasn't just delivering environmental outcomes, it was also developing job opportunities for communities that have been really severely affected by COVID due to loss of tourism and that sort of thing. So and I think currently it's quite hard to measure that impact, and obviously this goes back to the EY findings as well, that a measurement of those jobs and connections and stakeholder engagement is so key moving forward, because that's where a lot of the value in these programs is.
Sam, can I jump in there as well and say that it really came out clear to us that it was a lot of the overlap was that social benefit of the projects and how they deliver community outcomes, not just about the environmental outcomes and the objectives that the state government has. So growing region, I think you've got them there on the screen now, but growing regions, investing in small business, supporting jobs, all of those things, growing skills and capacity, not only in the wider community, but in traditional owner groups as well. So that came out quite strong, as NRIP can tap into that level of objective over and above just the NRIP priorities.
So one of the other things that you found was that NRIP has made a positive impact, and we can measure this on natural resources at a site scale, but we're not yet able to measure impact at a broader scale. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, there's a few reasons for that. The first one is that most of the NRIP funding was focused at a site scale. So that's probably the first point. The second one there is that a lot of the projects that have been done are relatively young. And I mean relatively in the terms of, you expect it takes a long time for trees to grow, for example. You might not yet see an impact, or you might not expect to see an impact until they're mature at 15, 20 years time. So a lot of these projects haven't reached their full impact mitigation potential. The third one there would be that many aren't big enough to see a landscape scale impact, largely because the sheer magnitude of the threat is larger than a small project scale that we're working on. So I think that really highlights to us that it's key now that all this stuff's been set up, the infrastructure's been set up, the project planning has been set up. We're at that precipice now. We've just started. And it's now a good idea to keep going, to keep with the legacy monitoring and really convinced that there's been a positive impact that can be expanded to a landscape scale.
So I just wanted to reinforce that the data is not suggesting we're incapable of measuring impact at a broader scale. It's more that the maturity of the NRMR program, the fact that it hasn't been running very long, simply means that we don't have this data yet.
Yeah, that's
right. And we've only got, I think in the SWIFT, there was only about 12 months of data in there. So, on an ongoing basis, if that data set can grow, it would be amazing to see the story that's telling in terms of the, landscape scale impacts.
And the other part of the story there too, Sam, sorry to jump in, but there's, in it, a lot of the assets we found, we haven't got quantified regional targets for yet. And that's because it's very difficult. And as a result of that, we also haven't got necessarily good ways of measuring impact to be able to track condition of those assets at a landscape scale yet either. So there's that process element to it where, the SWIFT, as Camille said, the SWIFT's just sort of got started. There's a few great methods there, but it needs to be expanded to be able to get the right measures to measure at a landscape scale.
For those who haven't seen the infographic yet, it's up on the screen. It's hard to see all the assets in one spot, but there are 6 that are listed there, which were seen as consistent assets across the state, and then the same with the threats. On the topic of SWIFT, the statewide indicators framework, your research found that this is a critical component to NRIP and to future iterations of NRIP. So why is this framework so critical?
So I wanted to channel my inner Rob on that one and say that data is key, I suppose. And that's a very boring response, but it's true. SWIFT is a way of providing a consistent approach to measuring success or otherwise, not only at a project scale, but at a program scale across a region, and again, at a higher state scale. So that provides that impetus or the return on investment or or evidence trail for the return on investment for the funder. So without it, there's no evidence of impact being either positive or negative. So no feedback for improvement either. So really you got to ask yourself, why would the next government invest if there's no evidence that there's been an improvement at any scale? So data is critical there. I'd also say it's nation leading at a state scale. So yes, we're at the beginning point of that, the starting point of the SWIFT, but there's no other state that we know of in the country that has this state scale consistently monitoring NRM impact. And I think if we can get that right and build the SWIFT, then we have got a compelling set of data that can be then used to drown out some of the other noise that politicians hear. So you can really stack it up against all of those other competing priorities for a politician's time.
I just want to add to that quickly. There was a comment from Jorg earlier on about, it's really hard to get funding for, monitoring programs. And I think the SWIFT is a really important tool because it visually shows the value of that monitoring. You can give that to a politician and they can see, well, all this money has delivered these outcomes. So it's actually also showing that value of the monitoring as well. And obviously, hopefully helps to support that in the future as well. Because I know it's been really hard to get funding for that historically.
Yeah, I mean, when we had a bit of a chat about this conversation beforehand, you used words like holy grail, that this data collection is really the holy grail to prove on-ground projects have a successful return on investment. that SWIFT has been a framework that's come about through really hard fought processes, and that we're leading the nation. But then when you look at the infographic, which is up on the screen, we see that the costs to keep SWIFT growing are quite realistic. And you corrected me because I said that, oh, we only need like $160,000 a year, but you also calculated that what we actually need is 10 to 15% of the total NRMR project budget to be able to collect this data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. Obviously, a lot of programs going in the past, they've always capped monitoring, the monitoring amount, and that's because I don't think anyone has really valued the evidence train. So I keep thinking about the adaptive management loop, which is that key principle of NRMR, where you've got collect the information, plan, act, monitor, and then evaluate. That monitoring component provides that evidence train. And if you don't have a significant amount of money attached to that bottom part of the adaptive management loop, then you can't possibly then evaluate at the end of the day. So that's a critical part. And it's a difficult one to put a number on across all of the different regions in Queensland, because it costs different amount of money. And we got this very strongly through the interviews. The NRM groups that have a huge geographic area, they've got to spend a lot of time getting back to the project site to be able to monitor. So we need to then link that back to the research priorities to be able to implement new technologies to make that monitoring easier. And I think the SWIFT needs to, well, in developing the SWIFT methods, we need to bring those new innovations in. And there's a few NRM groups doing that to try and get much better technology to make it easier for their project staff to monitor the impact.
So if you had to, no, heat maps, I nearly forgot the heat maps. Imagine if I forgot the heat maps, my goodness. Can we talk about heat maps, Paul?
Sure.
Yeah. So can you tell me about the heat maps that were developed and how they were intended to be used in terms of maximising NRM outcomes through NRMR?
So very, very bluntly, I guess, we are asked to have a look at the assets and condition of those assets and the threats on those assets at a state scale. So the heat maps, the purpose of the heat maps was to identify a problem at a state scale. So that's essentially back to the adaptive management framework, that collation of information at a state scale. It's the first step in that. So you can't identify that there's a problem if you haven't got the information collected. Are there problems with them? Of course there are at the state scale. So we highlighted that there was a lack of detail at scales that were useful for project prioritization. So we try to make it very clear that they shouldn't be used for prioritizing projects. We need a better way of collating and integrating those regional level data sets, which is a huge project because not all the regions collect the information in the same way. Some NRM groups are doing that already. And shout out to Paul McDonald at Southern Queensland Landscapes, who we worked a little bit with to compare the state scale data that we had for SQL and the regional scale data. So we had a look at that overlap. So I want to make the point here, Sam, that it's very much a starting point. As I said, they sort of start that adaptive management framework, and we've got now an understanding of where the gaps are in that data set. And we had 100 data sets that we looked at, but there are gaps in all of them. So it really starts that conversation and provides us a way of saying, well, what do we need now to be able to then track the actions at a much more meaningful scale for the NRMR program going forward. So we need to refine that, bring in the regional gaps, regional groups data. And we also, I think, working together at that state scale makes it for a stronger and more compelling case for investment at a state and federal level. So it provides that overarching state understanding. So I think this can be scaled up. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's a starting point, as I said before.
And there's also like a lot of limitations in that statewide data, which we try to articulate that, there's particularly the groundwater and threatened species, there's a real sensitive data. And even the weed overlay was last updated in 2018 by the state government. So that, there's a lot of data missing there.
Paul Donaghue from Healthy Land and Water has reflected, and he's also promised to shut up, but you don't need to do that, Paul. He said that he thinks the percentage of, this is looking at the threats, percentage of protected area under threats is way too low, especially given climate, pest and broader landscape threats, and also the percentage of threatened species. That's where he promised to shut up, but I bet he pops back into the chat. Penny Scott's also just added a comment about the costs for SWIFT, and she's just reinforce that the 10 to 15% in the infographic is calculated from the actual cost at the moment for a selection of current NRIP projects, which includes components such as field data collection, GIS and training, and the 15%, the higher end of that scale, is for projects which have distance or access challenges, and some projects the cost was around 8%. So just a couple of comments there.
Sam, can I address Paul Donahue's comment?
Please,
and
please,
it's a good one. And no doubt I can't see Paul, but no doubt he's smiling at me now. He knows I can't shut up when he asks me a question. But it's a good point to make, and I'll just make it clear that those percentages are the very high level category. So only. So it's not that there's no other threat, it's the very high level of threat overlaid with a very high level of asset. So if you combine the two categories below that, and we were trying to articulate the highest priority area, otherwise quite a bit of the state, most of the state would be red, and that's not particularly useful to differentiate. So if you combine the other two categories, it's quite large. And we can go into the detail about what high level means, but it's certainly in that report. And I'd encourage you to read that, Paul, for sure. And happy to have that discussion about what high level means and how we define that.
It's only 300 odd pages, so it should be quite easy to get through, Paul.
It's in the, it's also in the attached, there was an Excel spreadsheet that had all the categorizations in it. So, yeah.
Excellent. A couple of questions before we move on to a bit more of a focus on the NRIP components. Paul McDonald from SQ Landscapes has just said that our government friends have started working on what NRIP 2 might look like. And while their scope's narrowed to the Department of Resources portfolio, do you have any suggestions as to what they could focus their program on, bearing in mind they're keen to get on-ground impact?
What was the first part of that? Sorry, Sam, I just missed that.
Sorry, yeah, our government friends have started working on NRIP 2. And of course, their scope is narrowed to the Department of Resources portfolio, but do you have any suggestions for what the program might focus on?
I feel like I'm stepping out of my bounds here, but I know that Chris and others have been looking at ways of bringing in the other departments who have other jurisdictions over the different assets. So we identified 6 key assets at a state scale that were consistent across all of the NRM groups, but they're not the only ones that are critical. So it's really targeting the government department with the asset that is the most of the most concern for a particular project potentially. You know, from a regional point of view, at a statewide scale, then working together with all of the departments who have jurisdiction over native vegetation protection, as well as soil and agricultural land, as well as water and surface water and groundwater and wetlands. So there's multiple departments who have carriage over these assets from a legislative point of view now. So it's not just one department. I think we need to have that consistent approach from the state level and go into the state government departments individually. I know Chris has been doing that with the board.
So if you had to summarise the most significant finding out of this piece of research, the threats and assets, what do you think it would be?
I think the most significant one there, Sam, was that from the lessons learned component of the research, that the program itself, yes, has been successful, but it has not had enough time yet to have that larger scale impact for all the reasons I mentioned before. And so we're at that precipice. And if we don't continue to fund it, then the biggest thing we're going to lose is that preparation work. And again, that comes out strongly. So the relationships and the trust and the staff skills, you know, and they're building all of that prep work in order to be able to do the activities that lead to on-ground improvement or environmental improvement. And one example of that would be the project planning component of the regional coordination and evaluation. That's a really good example of good project planning, that it does incorporate those elements. So, you know, measuring project outcomes requires that good project planning up front. You don't do it, you know, you don't put the trees in the ground and try and figure out what impact you're going to measure. So it nominates those milestones and targets towards those milestones at the very starting point, which is not always done well across the country. I will say that that's a critical one. So typically it's an afterthought, but the RCE was really a way of getting that into the project planning framework, which I think was really critical. The communication component of that as well. So having a clear communication plan as part of the project planning was a critical one, because I know if Sheila's on the line, I mean, having no communication about the good work that an NRM group is doing, then, you know, you've lost that argument in a way to encourage investors coming through. So that planning then finally leads to a really good level of flexibility. And we had a lot of good feedback in the interviews that the flexible approach to that planning was critical for good project delivery. So understanding that, you know, natural disasters happen and being able to pivot towards another project or another outcome of a project was critical. And that actually goes to line up with that good adaptive management, which is one of the key principles of NRMR.
It's good timing that you mentioned communication, because if we move on to talking about the critical elements of success when we look at the spectrum of NRMR projects, you identified the elements of what makes a successful NRMR project, but you've evaluated a lot of projects, and of course good projects have lots of elements. Can you run us through what you found to be the critical elements of NRMR success when it comes to NRM bodies and their projects?
Yeah, it's funny that you go through the evaluation of all these programs, and we keep coming up with the same critical elements of success. And I think the common reaction to that list is, well, duh, of course it is. But I will say very clearly that it's surprising that how many programs that we evaluate that aren't successful, they don't have these elements. They're easy to say, but they're not always easy to implement. So communication and engagement, and not just talking at people, but actually having really good relationships, individual relationships with landholders and stakeholders and project delivery staff, and engaging with them, you know, actually engaging with them, not just talking at them. That's a critical one. And that's that prep work that we were talking about before. Good project planning and management. We sort of covered that off with the RCE, but that's a critical one. Not having a good project framework is not a great way of starting. Staff skills and retaining staff skills. That came out strongly in the interviews, particularly that having a consistency of funding across a long time frame meant that NRM groups could build up their staff as well as building the relationships with stakeholders. So building up their staff skills, retaining it, and then interacting with the other NRM groups when they needed external skill sets. So that true collaboration was a critical one. And then finally, having an evaluation plan established at that project planning stage. That came out strongly in that criteria. If you don't set it up at the start, then you're just cobbling it together at the end, and that's not always an easy way of showcasing the impact that you've had.
Which is an interesting challenge for the CEOs. Here's me interjecting with my own reflections when I should be facilitating. But with the CEOs and those advocating for improvements in NRIP too, when Paul's just said that the government's looking for on-ground outcomes, but we know that these other things, community engagement and collaboration and all of those things need to be funded adequately so that we can achieve the on-ground outcomes. And I'm not sure if it was you or some other researchers that spoke about how difficult it is to measure those networks, the trust and the collaboration, and that's something that we simply haven't got metrics on.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that came out strongly. I think Grace made the point in the chat and in the early discussion. You know, measuring that impact of trust and building on projects, we need to do it. It's easy for me to say that. It's difficult. It's really difficult to do that. But I think collectively, that's probably a big challenge to be able to do that. And so we can really identify how much time is spent by the NRM groups to do that. I mean, I was talking to one of the RLOs, I think up in Burnett Mary region a few months ago, where you know, they estimated 40% of their time was working on reporting, and then the other 40% was talking with stakeholders. So, you know, straight away, then you've only got a very small amount of time then to actually do the project. So that was a critical part of it. And actually even getting that metric of how much time is spent talking with landholders, going back and talking with them again and again and getting stakeholders on board. I mean, maybe even that's the first starting point. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think we need to as a group.
We only have sorry, Paul, just quickly, and just say, you know, obviously NRM groups have had 20 years to establish these relationships. You know, they have got these connections. They know, you know, obviously coming back to the EY report, you know, they know where to get the skills that they need to deliver programs. Yeah, you can't put a value on that. They're a known deliverer of NRM outcomes for governments. You know, there's certainty there if they fund programs that they know that they will get outcomes. And in this day and age, it's good to have that certainty as well. So yeah, I think having some way to put a metric or value on that would be really important moving forward.
We only have time for one more question, wrapping up. So if you could keep this quick, not like your report. Joking. So Paul, Camille, both of you, if there was just one thing that regional NRM bodies improved as a result of this body of work that you've done, what would it be?
I had 4 things just for that quip about our report, Sam. I won't go into that. No. Data collection. I know that's boring, and I've said that before, but we need better numbers to be able to stack up to against all the other noise that politicians hear, putting it in a way that they can compare and contrast with all the other priorities they've got. And that is around getting better data together for where the condition and state of the assets and threats are, pulling that regional data into a state level prospectus, quantifying regional targets where we can, and assess that so we can assess the projects and success against it, and then have a prioritization for consistency in measurement of that across the group. So expanding the SWIFT, and then finally that measuring of the trust, having that as part of a target setting approach, potentially really getting into the social science. There's a lot of social science literature here. So there are methods to do this. It's how to do it effectively, like every other monitoring program, how to do it effectively across a state size of Queensland.
Anything to add, Camille?
I just think it's a really exciting time to be working in NRM at the moment. We're starting to finally place a value on environmental assets. And I think, working together collaboratively, there's some really amazing skills across all of the NRM groups, trying to work together and use that collective power to deliver outcomes, I think would be really good. I think, the SWIFT was a great opportunity all the NRM groups to come together and develop a tool that they developed from the ground up. They have ownership of the data, they can actually show the outcomes that they're delivering. So I think working together is really, really key. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see what comes next, I guess. It's very exciting, I think.